The small room hummed with quiet anticipation. A single overhead light flickered above a round table where a few people sat, glancing nervously at one another. At the heart of it all was Barron Trump. Tall for his age, his face a mix of youthful curiosity and the weight of his family legacy. He was used to the spotlight, accustomed to the constant attention that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, it wasn't about politics or wealth or fame. As Barron sat quietly in the corner of the room, his eyes wandered over to the young girl sitting opposite him. Her name was Lily, a bright-eyed child with a smile that could light up the dimmest of rooms. She had been waiting all day for this moment, her heart racing with excitement. It wasn't every day she had the chance to speak with someone like Barron, especially someone with such a unique perspective on the world. The room was buzzing with hushed voices as people exchanged glances. The air was thick with the unspoken question. What would happen when the little girl, only 10 years old, asked Barron about something that had been on her heart for weeks? Would he give her the simple answer she was hoping for? Or would the weight of his family's influence change the way he responded? Barron, ever the reserved figure, shifted in his seat and met Lily's gaze. She seemed so small, sitting there with her legs dangling off the edge of her chair. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes, those big brown eyes, were filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. She had something important to ask, something that had been weighing on her for quite some time, and Barron, for the first time in a long while, wasn't sure how to answer. The air grew still as Lily took a deep breath and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a question much bigger than her. "Barron," she said, "I've been wondering, how do you keep your faith when everything around you feels so uncertain?" The room fell silent. Barron blinked, his mind racing. Faith. It was a word that had always seemed so distant to him, a concept wrapped in the complexities of life, politics, and public image. He had never been asked about faith in such a personal way. Sure, he had attended church with his family, participated in public ceremonies that seemed more like obligations than choices. But now, as Lily looked at him with those innocent eyes, something shifted inside him. The question lingered in the air, hanging between them like a delicate thread. And for the first time, Barron felt the weight of his own existence in a way he never had before. How did he keep his faith? Was it just a part of his upbringing? Something he went through the motions of? Or was there something deeper? Something more profound that he hadn't yet discovered? Barron stared at Lily, her question still echoing in his mind. The weight of it hung heavily in the air, pulling at something deep inside him that he couldn't quite grasp. He was used to being shielded from the harder questions, the ones that touched on his soul rather than his public persona. His father's world, his family's world, had always been about control, power, and image. Faith was just another part of that image. Something to be seen, but not necessarily felt. But Lily wasn't asking about the image. She wasn't asking about appearances or what others expected him to say. She was asking something real, something personal. It wasn't like Barron had never wondered about faith before. He had been raised with the same values, the same ceremonies, as any other child growing up in a family of wealth and privilege. He had attended services, said prayers, and bowed his head when it was expected. But those moments had always felt distant, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Faith was a word he heard often, but didn't fully understand. His eyes flicked nervously to the other people in the room. His mother, Melania, sitting silently in the corner, watching with a look of deep contemplation. She had always been a calming presence in his life, a silent force of strength, but even her gentle gaze felt distant now, like there was a wall between them that he couldn't scale. Then there was his father, Donald Trump, who had always spoken about faith as if it were a commodity, something to be bought, traded, and used to further a cause. Donald had never been one to discuss deep matters of the heart, at least not in the way Lily was asking. Faith, for him, was more about appearances than anything else. Suddenly, Barron felt a rush of frustration. Frustration that this question, this one little question, was making him confront a part of his life that he had never fully explored. It was like a door had been cracked open, and now he couldn't close it again. His heart raced, and he could feel a tightness in his chest. The pressure of expectations of who he was supposed to be was suffocating. He wanted to be real with Lily, to give her an answer that felt honest. But how could he? He wasn't sure he even had the answer himself. Lily was still waiting, her eyes wide with trust. She was looking at him as though she believed that he had the answers, that somehow he could explain everything that was so unclear to her. Barron felt an unexpected weight in his chest, a burden that had nothing to do with his family's name, but everything to do with the innocence of the question. How do you keep your faith when everything around you feels so uncertain? The room seemed to hold its breath. Barron felt the eyes of his mother, his father, the other people in the room pressing on him, expecting him to say something profound, something fitting of his family's legacy. But this wasn't about legacy. This wasn't about image. This was about something deeper, something real. His mind raced as he looked at Lily, trying to find the words that would make sense of it all. But before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. His mother's voice, soft but firm. "Barron, you don't have to have all the answers right now," Melania said, her calm demeanor grounding him. "Sometimes, it's okay not to know. What matters is that you're searching for them." But Barron wasn't sure that was enough. It wasn't just a question anymore. It was the beginning of something. Something he wasn't prepared for. Something that might change everything. The room felt even smaller now, like the walls were closing in. And Barron realized with a mix of fear and resolve that this was the moment everything shifted. The question Lily had asked him, so simple, yet so profound, had just pulled him into a journey he hadn't expected. And there was no turning back. For the first time in his life, Barron felt completely unmoored. The question Lily had asked him reverberated in his mind long after the room had gone quiet. He had always been the quiet observer in his family, the one who didn't draw attention, the one who let others lead. He was content with the role he had played, always in the background, always protected from the harshness of the world. But now, that world was breaking through, and for the first time, Barron was unsure of how to navigate it. Over the next few days, Barron found himself struggling to escape the gravity of Lily's question. He tried to distract himself with the usual routine, schoolwork, meetings, even playing video games with friends. But nothing seemed to help. The question lingered, waiting patiently at the edge of his thoughts, a constant presence that refused to be ignored. He started questioning everything, his upbringing, his faith, the quiet conversations he'd overheard at the dinner table between his parents. He had always assumed faith was something that people either had or didn't. It was black and white, simple. But now everything felt gray, and Barron wasn't sure which direction to turn. He could still hear his mother's voice telling him that it was okay not to have all the answers. But that didn't comfort him. It only made him feel more lost, more disconnected from the life he had always known. How could he be okay with not knowing? Wasn't his family supposed to have everything figured out? Wasn't that what they had always prided themselves on? Barron's mind churned as he sat in his study one evening, staring out the window at the distant skyline of New York City. He thought about Lily, her earnestness, her belief that he held the answers she so desperately sought. Could he really tell her that he didn't know? Could he admit, even to himself, that he was still searching for something more than the answers he had been given? The weight of the question started to press in on him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answer wasn't easy. It wasn't something he could pull from memory or recite from a book. Faith wasn't something you simply had because you were told to. It was something you had to find for yourself, and Barron wasn't sure if he had ever done that. The next day, Barron went to the church his family often attended. It was the same building he'd been in countless times before, familiar, comforting, and structured. But this time, as he sat in the back pew, listening to the choir sing softly, Barron felt disconnected. The words of the sermon floated over him, empty and distant, like a language he hadn't learned. It was then that he realized he wasn't sure if he even believed in what was being said anymore. The rituals had always been there, part of the life he had known. But had they ever meant anything beyond that? Was it enough to simply follow tradition, or did he need to find his own truth, his own connection to something greater than himself? As Barron sat in the church, the weight of doubt began to press down on him. What if he couldn't find faith at all? What if Lily was right, and everyone else around him was just going through the motions, pretending to believe in something they didn't truly understand? He wanted to leave, to run away from these thoughts that were suffocating him. But as he turned to go, he saw a figure standing at the entrance of the church, his mother, Melania. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. "Sometimes, we have to walk through the darkness to find the light," she said softly, her voice steady, as though she had anticipated his inner turmoil. Barron nodded, but the uncertainty remained. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront the darkness or if he could ever find the light. But he knew one thing: his journey had only just begun. The days after Barron's visit to the church passed in a blur. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him, a quiet unraveling of everything he had once known. The weight of his own doubts gnawed at him, and the question that Lily had asked seemed more pressing with each passing hour. It felt as though the very foundation of his life had been shaken, an invisible crack in the walls of his understanding, and no matter how hard he tried to patch it up, it was still there, widening. Then, something happened that Barron hadn't anticipated: a phone call. He had been sitting at the kitchen table one evening, flipping through a book on philosophy, trying to make sense of his thoughts, when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" Barron answered, half expecting a telemarketer or some unsolicited call. "Barron?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but different, a bit shaken. "It's Lily. I need to talk to you about something important." "Lily?" Barron felt a jolt in his chest. His thoughts immediately shot back to the moment they'd shared weeks earlier. She had asked him that question about faith, and in the time since, he had thought about little else. But now she was calling him? Why? What could she possibly need to talk to him about? He was the one who was supposed to have the answers, not the other way around. Of course. What's wrong? Barron's voice cracked slightly as he stood up from the table, the weight of her tone making him uneasy. "I don't know how to say this," Lily began, her voice trembling, "but I've been going through something big. My mom, she's been really sick for a while. I didn't want to tell anyone because I didn't want anyone to worry. But now I don't know what to do." Barron's heart sank as he processed the words. His mind couldn't immediately grasp the enormity of what Lily was saying. Her mom? Sick? He had never heard anything about this. It seemed so out of place, so far removed from the innocent question Lily had asked him, about faith. The girl who had once seemed so full of wonder was now facing something dark and incomprehensible. "I don't know how to feel anymore," Lily continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I asked you about faith, maybe it would help me understand. Maybe it would make it all less scary. But now I'm not sure of anything." The room around Barron seemed to close in. This was no longer a theoretical question about faith. This was real, raw, immediate, and painful. Barron had always thought faith was something that existed in the abstract, something for people to debate or discuss from a safe distance. But now, standing on the precipice of Lily's pain, Barron felt the full force of the question she had posed to him. He wasn't just searching for his own answers anymore. This was bigger than himself. It was about how to help someone else find meaning, when the darkness had already crept so close. He leaned against the counter, his mind spinning. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But as he listened to Lily's voice crack with vulnerability, something inside him clicked. This, he realized, was the real test of faith. Not in some distant, grand, philosophical sense, but in the raw, messy way that life confronted you when you weren't prepared for it. "Lily," Barron said, his voice steady now, though his heart was racing. "I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to make everything better, but I'll be here. We'll figure this out together. For the first time in weeks, Barron felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't certainty, but it was a beginning. And that, Barron realized, was all anyone really needed in the face of something as uncertain and fragile as faith. As the call ended, Barron stood still for a moment, breathing deeply. He had just stepped into something far larger than himself, and the weight of it was both terrifying and liberating. But in that moment, Barron understood something he hadn't before. Faith wasn't something you could just find in books or sermons. It was something you built, step by step, in the most unexpected places. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the first step in his own journey. It was late afternoon when Barron arrived at Lily's house. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, but Barron hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with the weight of the conversation they had shared just days ago, the burden of her pain pressing down on him. This was no longer just about an abstract question on faith. This was about the real, fragile world that could break your heart without warning. Lily had told him she would be waiting in the garden. As Barron walked through the gate, he could see her sitting on the porch, a faint figure silhouetted against the soft light. Her posture was slumped, her face pale, and her eyes, those bright, hopeful eyes, were clouded with uncertainty. Barron's chest tightened as he approached her, unsure of what to say or how to start. "Lily," he said softly, stepping onto the porch. "I'm here." Lily looked up, and Barron saw the sadness that had settled into her features. She had always been so full of life, so full of questions and wonder, but now, in front of him, she seemed different. Older, burdened by something she couldn't fully explain. "I don't know what to do anymore, Barron," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "I keep praying for my mom to get better, but it doesn't seem to work. I'm scared, Barron. I'm scared of losing her, and I don't know if I even believe in what I'm praying for anymore." Barron stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a question about faith. It was a question of life and death. Barron had never been confronted with something so raw, so real. How could he help her? How could he, someone who had spent so much of his life hiding behind walls of privilege and expectation, possibly offer anything that would make a difference? He swallowed hard, trying to steady his thoughts. There was no script for this, no neat answer to give. But he knew one thing now. He had to stop running from the uncertainty that had gripped him for so long. He had spent too many days trying to ignore the discomfort, trying to convince himself that the answers would come on their own. But life wasn't that simple, and neither was faith. Taking a step closer, Barron crouched down to Lily's level, his voice low and steady. "I don't have all the answers, Lily. I don't know why bad things happen or why people get sick. I don't know why faith sometimes feels like it's not enough. But I can tell you this. Just because things don't go the way we expect doesn't mean we're alone." Lily's eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and hope, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. Barron hesitated, then reached out, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to have all the answers either," he continued. "But what I've learned is that sometimes faith isn't about having everything figured out. It's about holding on, together. Even when things don't make sense. We're not meant to face this alone." Lily blinked back tears, her breath shaky. Barron's words weren't a grand revelation or some perfect piece of advice. They were just raw, human honesty. The kind of honesty Barron had been too afraid to admit to himself until now. But it was enough. Lily's expression softened, and she finally reached up, placing her hand on his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I needed to hear that." Barron nodded, his heart aching as he realized just how much his own journey had shifted. He had entered this moment unsure, searching for answers in the darkness. But in this fragile moment of connection, Barron saw something clear. Faith wasn't something you could force or simply accept because it was expected. It was something you lived through, the difficult moments, the fear, the uncertainty, and sometimes all you could do was trust that the darkness would eventually give way to light. As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, Barron felt something change inside him. The answers weren't coming all at once, but he didn't need them all right now. What mattered was this moment, this small, quiet victory. And for the first time, Barron knew that it was enough. As the days passed, things didn't magically get better. Lily's mother continued to battle her illness, and the weight of uncertainty never fully lifted. But Barron found himself thinking about the conversation with Lily more often, reflecting on the unexpected depth of that moment. He had come to her seeking answers, but in the end, it was the simple act of showing up, of being present for someone else, that had made all the difference. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about sharing in the vulnerability, the uncertainty, and the hope that somehow, together, they could find their way through. One afternoon, Barron visited Lily again. They sat in her garden, much like they had before, but this time, the air between them was different, lighter, even amidst the heavy circumstances. Lily's mother was still in the hospital, and there were no guarantees about the future. But they had both learned something important. That faith wasn't always about holding on to something tangible. Sometimes, it was about trusting the journey, trusting the people around you, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable in the face of the unknown. "Thank you for being here, Barron," Lily said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Barron gave a small, genuine smile. He hadn't fixed everything, hadn't come up with the perfect words to make it all right. But in that moment, he realized that wasn't the point. The point was that they had faced it together, and that had made all the difference. As Barron stood to leave, he took one last look at Lily, who was sitting there, looking up at the sky as if she, too, had found a little peace amidst the storm. He felt a quiet sense of pride in himself. Pride not in the answers he had given, but in the person he was becoming. He was no longer running from his doubts, nor was he afraid of the questions that had once seemed too big to tackle. He had taken a first step, and that, Barron realized, was the most important one of all. And as he walked away, a single thought filled his mind. Sometimes, the greatest act of faith is simply showing up. The journey was far from over, but Barron was no longer afraid to walk it.